and welcome back to Coffee and World. Do you remember my breakdown of the trash trade in the last episode? Well, that trade, like all global trade these days, depends on two key things: container ships and open shipping routes. And both of these are inventions of the second half of the 20th century. So, let's get right into the important roles they play in global trade and today's geopolitics. I don't need to tell you how important global trade is. Supply shortages, traffic jams at ports, and inflation have been all over the headlines. And the single image of global trade that dot these pages, it's this. Longer than 4 football fields or the Empire State Building, cargo ships like these can hold as many as 20,000 containers. And because a single container could be filled with more than 200 bikes, it means that a vessel like the Ever Given is technically able to transport enough bikes for every citizen of Milan and Rome combined. We take this container for granted today, but it actually had to be invented by this American in 1956. As a former truck driver, McLean got sick of waiting for ages at ports for ships to be unloaded manually, and he came up with the idea of a steel box that could fit all sorts of goods and easily transport them. Indeed, before the invention of containers, shipping was an extremely lengthy and expensive process. It's sufficient to think that goods used to spend more time at docks than at sea, and that dock workers used to account for 70% of the final shipping costs. But thanks to, well, precisely a huge container and the standardization of its size, loading goods on trucks or trains became automated, and that exponentially cut time and transport costs. And now we know that that simple invention ultimately had an outsized impact. As the shipping industry became so convenient, pretty much anything from fresh bananas to cars or, well, trash could easily make it to the other side of the planet. And that's how we got to these super extended and interconnected global supply chains, which have functioned so well that most people hardly ever thought about what's behind them, making of global shipping something of an invisible industry. But then this happened in the middle of a pandemic, and all of a sudden the industry came under a huge spotlight. That was somehow the perfect pandemic meme, right? We were all rooting for the Ever Given and ourselves to get unstuck. But this was a different kind of Suez crisis, and we'll get to the first one that crystallized the importance of waterways and shipping routes that stitched together the international economy. While the Suez Canal is no stranger to blockades, one that lasted up to 8 years, nowhere near 12% of our record volumes of global trade passed through it back then. Therefore, this time, even a few days of traffic jam in the canal were enough to wreak havoc in the international trading system, especially at a time when we were all buying things online like crazy because, well, what else could we do? But how did the Ever Given get stuck in the first place? Well, one practical reason is that in the last 25 years, vessels have quadrupled in size, and existing canals simply weren't built to accommodate them. That's why in recent years, both the Panama and Suez have been expanded, but apparently, still not quite enough. Yet no matter their size, straits and canals have always been at risk of turning into potential bottlenecks, either accidentally or intentionally. Precisely for the central role that waterways play in the global economy, many countries have long wanted to control them for their own benefit. And while the notion of freedom of navigation may be taken for granted now, it was actually borne out much geopolitical contestation. Yep, battle for control of sea lanes are as old as the Trojan War, a war that was more likely initiated to win mastery of a strait, rather than to win Helena's heart. In fact, it was probably Greece's ambition to take control of the Hellespont, today known as the Dardanelles, that pushed it to war against Troy. And this because the Hellespont represented the key access to trading routes in the Black Sea and its bordering countries. And by the same token, Russia's foreign policy centuries later was mainly about controlling the Bosphorus and Dardanelles to expand its military and commercial routes through the Mediterranean. Now, let's fast forward to the rise of Pax Britannica. The main reason that the sun never set on the British Empire, of course, had much to do with its dominance of the seas, and of straits too. The British Empire, in fact, was sewn together with purpose. It's no coincidence the British colonies were formed around the most important shipping routes in the world. Take Singapore, a former British territory that sits in the middle of the crucial Malacca Strait. Soon after the city-state was founded, it was immediately turned into a free port to serve as a major trading hub between the East and the West. And arguably, much of its incredible economic growth has been the result of that decision. Now, let's return to where we began with the Suez. Just like empire's power may depend on control of key waterways, their unraveling can also be precipitated by the loss of that grip. And that's exactly what happened to Britain when Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal in 1956. Ironically, in the same year that the container was invented.
While in Egypt, the steadily growing power of the regime which overthrew Farouk has been evident to the world. The Western nations, thinking of the Suez Canal, watched uneasily. Egypt turned eastwards for her supplies of arms, and Russia's Foreign Minister Shapilov found Nasser a ready customer.
This episode, which almost triggered a nuclear confrontation, eventually marked the nothing short of the dusk of European imperialism. And as it turned out, the sun eventually set on the British Empire. Empires may be relics of the past, but straits or canals are today as relevant as they've ever been. And depending on where you sit, these waterways can either be a leverage or a choke point. For a country like China, it's the latter. China depends on imports for 3/4 of its energy consumption. And because 80% of that trade passes through the Malacca Strait, China is highly vulnerable to its potential blockade. This is certainly one of the reasons why China has significantly expanded its naval capabilities in recent years. But while the Chinese Navy is currently the largest in the world, it still lags far behind the United States in terms of power projection. So, the world's largest trading power, China, is not also the world's most dominant naval power, which is a bit of an historical anomaly, but that's where the Belt and Road enters the discussion. Many of you have probably heard of the BRI in the context of China building a bunch of infrastructures in developing countries. But the BRI also serves the purpose of bypassing the risky Malacca Strait, relying instead on alternative land routes for its trade and energy supplies. It's no coincidence that China has invested heavily in rail, including the high-speed kind. And check this out. But another option may now be looming on the horizon, where nature has unintentionally lent a hand: the Arctic. As climate change is melting the Arctic ice cap, new shipping opportunities are now opening up. In fact, for China, shipping through the Arctic could cut the time to Europe by half and avoid existing choke points. At this point, the Arctic route is still aspirational, but if challenges are overcome, then maybe it could radically shift the geopolitical game around straits. Stuck ships, narrow supply chains, stuffed ports, the pandemic has surely contributed to make the invisible industry much more visible. And it was about time, because it's precisely what makes globalization work day in and day out. And potential disruptions, either caused by geopolitical gamesmanship, geographical constraints, or simply by the law of supply and demand, are always around the corner. But without freedom of navigation and low transport costs, well, we can all kiss goodbye to our Amazon second-day delivery and to those fresh avocados that we really like for brunch. And of course, we Italians wouldn't be able to have our most cherished espresso because Italy doesn't grow coffee. It comes here on one of those containers. Thank you for watching, and until next time on Espresso Shots.